I think the Queen's duty and her service, her tolerance, her commitment to others, I think that's all been incredibly important to me. It's been a real sort of guiding example of just what sort of a good monarch can be. And it's been incredibly insightful for me growing up, watching her leadership in that role.
So what in particular would you say you learned?
What Camilla did that made Prince William and Catherine to order her to leave Windsor Lodge. Okay, stay with this for a moment, because that title points to something far more serious than a disagreement over rooms. According to the account at the center of this story, Catherine discovered that part of Windsor Lodge had been placed under restrictions she had never approved, while personal items connected to William's late mother had quietly been removed. What made the situation different was the paper trail. A household directive appeared with handwritten amendments attributed to Camilla, and senior staff had allegedly been pressured not to bring the changes directly to William. This was no longer about furniture, decoration, or who preferred one room over another. It was about who believed they had the authority to decide what happened inside a residence carrying years of family history. And when William finally saw what had been kept from him, the question was no longer whether Camilla had gone too far. It was whether the changes had been deliberate from the beginning. Catherine did not need a dramatic announcement to understand that something was wrong. The evidence was sitting inside the residence itself. A section of the lodge that had once been accessible was suddenly being treated differently. Staff were careful with their answers.
I do think it's incredible how strong and how you've been able to cope, really. And I put that down to your really early years, childhood experience, but also the relationship that you've got. You're amazingly close.
Yeah.
And yes, you know.
Most of the time.
Most of the time. No, but you know, and some families sadly aren't as lucky as you guys have been, and being able to share things.
But we have been brought closer because of the circumstances as well. That's the thing.
Yeah.
You know, you are, uniquely bonded because.
Familiar arrangements had changed. Then Catherine noticed that several personal belongings were no longer where they had always been kept. The items were not described as casually misplaced. They had reportedly been wrapped, labeled, and moved into storage. That detail mattered. It suggested preparation. Someone had known what was being moved, where it was going, and how it was supposed to be handled. And when the paperwork connected to that movement began to surface, the situation became harder to dismiss. Hi viewers, if someone had quietly removed something deeply connected to your family and kept you out of the decision, would you stay silent just to keep the peace, or would you demand the truth? Leave your answer in the comments, because that simple choice is exactly what makes this story so uncomfortable. Catherine's response, according to the account, was not to confront Camilla in anger. She started looking for records. That decision would become important, because memories can be disputed, conversations can be denied, and private assurances can disappear. Written instructions are different. They leave dates, names, signatures, amendments, and trails. One document drew particular attention. It was an unsigned household directive containing handwritten changes. The amendments were reportedly in Camilla's handwriting. The wording mattered because the directive did more than describe ordinary household arrangements. It appeared to alter access to a section of the residence and gave staff instructions concerning belongings that Catherine had expected to remain within the family's control. That was the first moment the story moved from suspicion to something much more serious. The question was no longer simply who had moved the belongings. It became who had changed the instructions, who had carried them out, and why nobody had told William. And there was another problem. Senior staff were reportedly aware of the changes. According to the account, some had been pressured to keep the matter away from William. That meant the information had not simply been overlooked. If the account was accurate, people inside the household had been placed in the uncomfortable position of choosing between following an instruction and revealing what was happening to a member of the family who had a direct interest in the residence.
Together.
With loving books.
And loving books.
As loving books.
And you're here on this historic visit, 250 years of our country.
That's extraordinary.
How has your trip been?
Well, it's been whistle stop. It's been really good fun, but We have moved quite fast.
You've been to a lot of places, to quite a few.
We have, but it's been wonderful, and everybody's been very kind and welcoming. Well, it's always a pleasure to be here, and always lovely.
That is where the atmosphere inside Windsor Lodge began to change. Staff who had once spoken freely became cautious. Questions produced careful answers. Decisions that should have been straightforward suddenly seemed to require private approval. The residence itself appeared to be developing two versions of authority, the one written into its normal household procedures, and another being exercised behind closed doors. William was eventually brought into the matter. He did not begin by making accusations. He wanted the original records. That distinction matters. If Camilla had simply misunderstood an arrangement, the documents should have cleared it up. If staff had acted independently, the records should have shown that too. If the changes had been properly authorized, there should have been evidence of that authorization. Instead, according to the story, the records raised more questions. The disputed directive was not standing alone. Other household instructions began appearing beside it. Access changes, staff decisions, storage records, renovation-related paperwork. Each item might have been explained separately. Together, they began to suggest a pattern. Catherine had already preserved the information she had found. William now wanted the original paper trail behind it. That was the moment the dispute stopped being a private disagreement and became an internal review. But the most revealing detail had not yet appeared. Before William and Catherine could decide what Camilla should do next, they needed to understand exactly what she believed Windsor Lodge allowed her to control. That meant going back to the residence arrangements themselves and examining the conditions surrounding her use of the property. And that search was about to uncover something that could change the entire meaning of the confrontation. Because if the documents showed that Camilla's authority was limited, then every restricted doorway, every relocated belonging, and every staff instruction would have to be viewed differently. The first question was simple. What exactly had Camilla been authorized to control? The answer was waiting inside the records, and once William saw it, there would be no easy way for anyone to explain the Windsor Lodge changes as a simple misunderstanding. If you think William and Catherine were right to demand answers instead of looking away, stay with this story and support the channel, because the next part gets much worse, and the document they uncover could change everything. A residence can be changed by decoration, but authority is changed by instructions. A room can be rearranged, but a restriction on family access creates a different message. It tells people who is expected to enter, who is expected to wait, and whose decision is supposed to matter. That was why Catherine's discovery carried such weight. She was not simply looking at an empty space where an object had once stood. She was looking at a sequence of decisions. First came the removal, then the labeling, then the storage instruction, then the apparent change in access. Behind those decisions were staff members expected to carry them out without creating questions. The more Catherine looked, the harder it became to believe that every change had happened independently. There was also the timing. The disputed instructions were being examined while their consequences were still visible inside the lodge. Staff were adjusting to new arrangements. Rooms were being treated differently. The missing belongings could still be traced through storage records. That gave William and Catherine an opportunity to establish what had happened before explanations changed. If they had been added innocently, there should have been a straightforward explanation. If they had been added to clarify an approved instruction, someone should have been able to produce the approval. But if they had been added to expand control, then the document was no longer just household paperwork. It was evidence of intent. He did not need another rumor. He needed the original instruction, the original date, the people who received it, and the trail showing what happened afterward. Once those pieces were assembled, the next question would become impossible to avoid. Who had actually been directing Windsor Lodge? The first record William requested was not the document Catherine had found. It was the original occupancy file for Windsor Lodge, because that was where the real question had to be settled. If Camilla had been given unrestricted control, the paperwork should have made that clear. If her authority had limits, those limits could explain why the household changes had become so contentious. The file arrived with several supporting records. William went through them without making a public accusation. The focus was narrow at first. Who had authority over rooms, staff, household spending, and access? The distinction mattered because an instruction could be valid in one area and improper in another. The review therefore had to separate ordinary household decisions from actions that appeared to exceed them. One entry drew attention because it described the residents as subject to continuing family arrangements rather than permanent personal control. That wording did not settle the dispute, but it changed the direction of the review. William now had a reason to examine every later decision against the conditions attached to the arrangement.
Path, but with very good examples and guidance around you to support you. And I think that's what she's found to be the most effective for herself, is the fact that she has been able to, over the since 1952, the many years, understand how best she can make an effect with her role.
Catherine's records were placed beside the original file. The comparison exposed a growing mismatch. Some decisions had been presented to staff as settled, yet the supporting authorization was difficult to locate. Other instructions appeared to rely on verbal assurances rather than written approval. The absence of a clear record did not prove wrongdoing, but it created a problem that could no longer be brushed aside. Then the staffing records arrived. Several employees had been moved from duties they had performed for years. The changes were not necessarily unusual on their own. What mattered was the timing. Some reassignment notices appeared shortly after questions had been raised about access and household decisions. A few staff members had also been told to direct sensitive questions through a smaller circle of aides. That detail concerned William more than the room changes. A household can survive a new seating plan. It can survive different furniture. It can even survive a temporary disagreement over access. But when employees become uncertain about whom they are allowed to answer, the problem reaches another level. It affects the flow of information itself. One senior administrator reportedly told the review team that staff had been encouraged to avoid discussing the disputed arrangements directly with William. The administrator did not describe a formal ban. Instead, the instruction was presented as a matter of discretion. Staff were expected to let Camilla's office handle the issue. That distinction became important. If no one had explicitly ordered staff to conceal anything, then the review had to determine whether pressure had produced the same result. Several employees reportedly believed that challenging the new arrangements could damage their positions. Others simply followed the chain of command they thought had been established. William wanted names, dates, and copies. The review team began matching staff movements against household instructions. A pattern started to emerge. Decisions concerning particular rooms were followed by changes in the people responsible for those areas. Questions from administrators were redirected. Some routine matters were suddenly handled privately. Catherine then supplied another set of records. They showed that the residents had been undergoing changes that were broader than the original dispute suggested. Rooms were being reassigned. Household routines were being adjusted. Certain family arrangements had been altered without the normal level of consultation. None of these points alone proved a larger plan. Together, they gave the review a reason to look beyond the immediate confrontation, and that was exactly what William did. He asked for renovation requests, maintenance records, staffing instructions, security notes, and correspondence connected to the disputed areas. The objective was simple: establish a timeline. When the records were arranged by date, the sequence became harder to ignore. The earliest changes appeared before the most visible disagreement. Staff adjustments came before several access disputes. Planning discussions appeared before some of the room changes. The review had started with one directive. It was now examining a chain of decisions that appeared to stretch much further back. The significance was not that every action had been improper. The significance was that the decisions seemed to be moving in the same direction: more control, less shared access, greater dependence on Camilla's private aides. That was the point at which the review stopped treating each incident separately. The question changed from what happened to why the same outcome kept appearing. Then another employee came forward. This person had worked close enough to the household administration to see how instructions were being passed between offices. According to the account, the employee remembered an earlier discussion about changing the use of several rooms. The discussion had occurred before the confrontation that had brought the dispute into the open. That was significant because it suggested the room changes had not begun as a reaction to Catherine's questions. Someone had been thinking about them earlier. The employee could not establish the full purpose of the discussion, but one detail stood out. The rooms were being considered as a more permanent arrangement rather than a temporary solution. William asked for the notes. The notes were not immediately available. That absence created another problem. If the discussion had been informal, there might never have been a formal record. But if a written plan existed somewhere, it could reveal what the household had been preparing to do before anyone challenged it. Catherine focused on the dates. She compared the earliest staff changes with the first recorded room discussions. The dates were close enough to raise a new possibility. The residents may have been undergoing a deliberate restructuring before the dispute became visible. That possibility changed the emotional weight of everything. A mistake can be corrected. A misunderstanding can be explained. A planned sequence is different. The review team therefore widened its search. Private correspondence connected to the lodge was examined. Administrative messages were checked against staff instructions. The purpose was not to prove a conclusion in advance. It was to find out whether the same decisions had been discussed elsewhere. One message reportedly referred to future arrangements for rooms that were still being used under existing family schedules. Another communication suggested that staff should prepare for changes without announcing them broadly. That language mattered. It implied preparation. William still did not confront Camilla directly. He wanted the evidence complete before the conversation became personal. If he approached her too early, the dispute could collapse into competing recollections. If he waited until the records were assembled, the questions would be harder to dismiss. Meanwhile, pressure inside the lodge was increasing. Staff understood that the review was no longer limited to one disagreement. They also understood that their own decisions could become part of the record. Some employees became more willing to speak. Others became more cautious. Then the review found something that had not been mentioned during the initial discussions. A confidential document appeared to describe future control over specific rooms. Its wording was not yet enough to establish the entire purpose. But it raised a question that could no longer be avoided. Why were permanent arrangements being discussed at all? That was the point when William and Catherine stopped asking whether Camilla had overstepped in one decision. They began asking whether Windsor Lodge had been gradually repositioned around her authority. The document itself was not presented as a finished transfer of ownership. That would have made the issue obvious. Instead, its importance came from the practical instructions surrounding the rooms. It referred to future use, staffing, access, and arrangements that would reduce the role of the wider household. That made the wording more troubling. A permanent takeover did not have to be announced in one dramatic order. It could be built through small decisions made one after another. Change who controls a room, change who controls the staff, change who receives visitors, change what belongings remain visible. Eventually, the structure of the residence changes even if nobody ever declares that it has changed. That was the possibility now facing William. The review had started with a disputed household instruction. It had moved through staffing records, planning discussions, and private correspondence. Now it had reached a document describing a future arrangement, but the date on that document was still being checked, and the date could be more important than the wording. If it had been prepared before Catherine raised any questions, then the confrontation was not what created the dispute, it was what exposed it. And that left one question hanging over the entire review. Who knew about the plan before the family did, and who expected nobody to challenge it publicly? So if this situation deserves scrutiny rather than silence, support the channel now, because the next part exposes the document that could turn a household dispute into something much bigger. And walking away before that reveal means missing the evidence that changes the entire story. The date was finally confirmed, and it changed the direction of the entire review. The document had been prepared weeks before the confrontation at Windsor Lodge became visible to William and Catherine. That meant the dispute could no longer be explained simply as a reaction to a disagreement. The planning had started earlier, the restrictions came later. The missing belongings followed. Then the confrontation exposed the pattern. For William, that sequence created a problem far more serious than a disagreement over household management. If the document had been prepared in advance, Someone had already decided how the residence should operate before Catherine began asking questions. The review now had to determine what that document was intended to accomplish and who had been expected to carry it out. The pages were examined again. Several sections dealt with rooms that had previously been available for family use. The language described future arrangements in a way that suggested those spaces would no longer operate under the same shared system. Staff assignments were also referenced. Certain duties were expected to move under a different chain of instruction. Nothing in the document openly declared that Windsor Lodge belonged to Camilla. That was precisely why it mattered. The apparent strategy was not a single dramatic claim of ownership. It was a gradual shift in control. Rooms could be reassigned, staff could be redirected, access could become restricted, personal belongings could be moved. If each decision was treated separately, none appeared capable of changing the residence by itself. Together, they could. Catherine understood the significance immediately. The changes she had noticed were no longer isolated incidents. They appeared to fit within a structure that had been considered before the family realized anything was happening. William asked another question. Who had seen the document? The review team began tracing its circulation. Copies had reportedly moved through a limited group of aides rather than the wider household administration. That explained why several senior employees seemed uncertain about the new arrangements. Information was not flowing through the usual channels. One aide reportedly acknowledged seeing an earlier version. The aide remembered discussions about room use and staffing, but could not say that Camilla herself had personally explained every instruction. That distinction mattered. The review could establish what the document said, but intent still had to be considered carefully. Camilla's position, according to the account, remained that she had not deliberately targeted Catherine. The changes could be presented as household management decisions. Staff could argue they had acted on instructions they believed were legitimate. The disputed belongings could be described as part of broader rearrangements. But the timing continued to create difficulty. The document existed before the confrontation. The access restrictions appeared afterward. The belongings were moved during the same period, and staff were reportedly discouraged from taking the issue directly to William. The sequence gave the review a reason to examine the correspondence surrounding the document. That search uncovered references to future guest arrangements. Several rooms were being considered for use by Camilla's private visitors. The proposed arrangements would reduce flexibility for family gatherings and change how staff handled access. Again, no single line proved a permanent takeover. But the cumulative effect was clear enough to concern the people reviewing it. William wanted the original correspondence rather than summaries. That request produced another important discovery. A message from a senior household administrator had reportedly warned that certain changes required family consultation. The warning came before some of the disputed alterations were completed. It established that concerns had already been raised internally. The response was not a broad discussion. The instruction was to proceed. That detail removed one possible explanation. The changes could no longer easily be described as something nobody had realized might cause concern. At least one administrator had reportedly identified the problem in advance. The review then turned to the belongings connected to William's late mother. The record showed that their movement had been planned rather than improvised. The items were identified, packed, labeled, and assigned a destination. The timing placed their removal close to the planned changes, affecting access to the rooms. That was enough for William to insist that every related instruction be examined. He wanted to know whether the belongings were supposed to be moved temporarily or permanently. He wanted the name of the person who approved the storage arrangements. He wanted to know whether Catherine had been consulted. Most importantly, he wanted to know whether the move was connected to the wider plan for the residence. The answers were incomplete. Some records described storage, others described room preparation. Neither explanation fully accounted for the timing. Then the review found a second reference to permanent arrangements. It was not the same document. This reference appeared in correspondence between aides discussing how certain rooms would be used in the future. The language was careful, but the direction was unmistakable. The residence was being planned around a more exclusive arrangement. That was the moment the story became considerably more serious. William and Catherine were no longer dealing with a single household instruction. They were looking at evidence suggesting that control over Windsor Lodge had been gradually reorganized before anyone challenged it. And the most uncomfortable question was still unanswered. Why had the plan been prepared so early? If the intention had simply been to accommodate renovations, there would have been no obvious reason to establish permanent room arrangements before the dispute. If the changes were temporary, why were staff structures being adjusted around them? If the belongings were only being protected during work, why had family consultation been bypassed? Each answer created another question. That was exactly what the review needed. The investigation did not have to prove every rumor surrounding the lodge. It only had to establish what the records could support. Dates, instructions, responses, staff movements, access decisions, property records. The more carefully those pieces were compared, the more difficult it became to treat the situation as one unfortunate misunderstanding. William then requested the correspondence held by senior aides. That request reportedly made some people uncomfortable. For weeks, instructions had moved through private channels. Some staff members had relied on verbal explanations. Others had kept copies because they were unsure whether later questions would arise. Now those records were being collected and compared. One message stood out because it referred to the lodge's future as though the outcome had already been decided. The message did not announce a transfer. It did something subtler. It discussed preparation. That single word carried enormous weight. Preparation meant the changes were not merely happening. Someone had been getting the residents ready for a different arrangement. Catherine's role in the review became even more important. She organized the documents by date and placed the household decisions beside the correspondence that preceded them. The pattern became easier to see. First came planning, then staff preparation, then changes to access, then movement of belongings, then the confrontation. The confrontation was not the beginning. It was the moment the plan became visible. That realization changed William's position. He no longer needed to ask whether one decision had gone too far. He needed to know whether the residents had been deliberately moved toward a new structure without his knowledge. The answer would determine what happened next. Camilla was given an opportunity to explain the documents and the timing. Her position remained that the arrangements did not represent an attempt to seize control from William and Catherine. She could argue that the residents required practical changes and that household staff had misunderstood the scope of certain instructions. But the earlier date remained. No explanation could make that date disappear. The document had existed before the confrontation. That fact forced the review toward its next stage. William now wanted the complete record of every instruction connected to the rooms named in the document. He wanted to know who drafted them, who amended them, who received them, and who acted on them. There was also the question of the staff who had been expected to carry out the changes. Their position was becoming increasingly difficult. If they obeyed instructions that later proved unauthorized, they could be blamed for participating. If they refused, they risked challenging people they believed held senior authority. That pressure explained why some employees had stayed silent for so long. It also explained why the records mattered so much to William. The staff could not be expected to settle the dispute themselves. They needed clear instructions from the household administration, not competing versions of authority arriving through private conversations. By this stage, the review had reached a point where another informal discussion would not be enough. The evidence had moved beyond personal impressions. It now involved documents, dates, instructions, and decisions that could be compared side by side. And one question remained especially dangerous. Who had decided that these changes could happen without William knowing? Until that question was answered, the review could not be considered complete. That distinction would determine what happened next inside Windsor Lodge. The evidence was now strong enough to demand a direct answer, but the next meeting would reveal whether Camilla could explain the plan without contradicting her own records. That is where this story was heading. And if standing silent while powerful people rewrite the rules feels wrong to you, do not look away now. Stay with this story, because the next part brings William and Catherine face to face with Camilla, and what happens after that is where the Windsor Lodge dispute gets even more serious. The door closed behind William, Catherine, and the senior officials, and for the first time, Camilla had nowhere left to hide behind uncertainty. The records were on the table. The dates had been checked. The disputed instructions had been traced. Now she had to explain why a plan for Windsor Lodge appeared to exist before anyone outside her circle knew there was a problem. The meeting was deliberately controlled. No public confrontation had been arranged. No cameras were present. No announcement had been prepared. William wanted answers, not spectacle. Catherine sat with the records that had been assembled during the review, while the officials responsible for the residence administration kept the discussion focused on documents and procedure. The first question was direct. Who authorized the changes? Camilla's position was that she had acted within her understanding of the arrangements surrounding the lodge. She did not accept that the decisions amounted to an attempt to exclude Catherine or William. The movement of belongings, the room changes, and the adjustments involving staff could, in her view, be explained as household decisions rather than a deliberate attempt to take control. But William did not ask what she believed the arrangements meant. He asked for the authority behind each decision. That difference mattered. One record concerned access, another concerned staffing, another concerned the use of rooms, another dealt with belongings. Each required a separate explanation. William wanted the name of the person who had approved it, the date of the approval, and the instruction that staff had received. The answers did not produce one clear authorization covering everything. Instead, the discussion returned repeatedly to Camilla's understanding of her position and to the assumption that senior authority had already been given. Then William asked about Charles. Camilla reportedly maintained that the king was aware of the arrangements. That claim immediately raised the most sensitive issue in the room. Awareness was not the same as approval for every action. Knowing that changes were being discussed did not automatically establish that every restriction, staffing decision, or movement of family belongings had been authorized. William wanted evidence, a signed instruction, a formal amendment, a written confirmation, something that connected the changes to the authority Camilla was invoking. Nothing presented during the meeting settled that question. Catherine then placed the disputed directive before the group. The handwritten amendments were examined again. The significance was not simply that changes had been written onto the document. It was that the amendments affected practical control over the residence. The discussion returned to the rooms. Why had access been altered? Why had staff been instructed differently? Why had belongings been moved before family consultation? And why had the document been prepared weeks earlier? Camilla denied deliberately targeting Catherine. That denial was important because it kept the confrontation from becoming a simple accusation and rebuttal. The issue had to be tested against the record. William then moved to the staff evidence. Several employees had reportedly been placed in a difficult position. They had received instructions that appeared to come through Camilla's household operation, while concerns raised by administrators had not produced a visible change. Some had been reluctant to speak because they believed challenging those instructions could have consequences. William asked whether staff had been told to keep the matter from him. The response was not a straightforward admission. The distinction again centered on wording. No one wanted to claim that a direct order to conceal the changes had been issued unless the records supported it. But the practical result remained troubling. Information concerning the residents had been contained within a smaller group, while decisions affecting family access were being implemented. Catherine's records showed another problem. Warnings had reportedly been raised before some of the changes were completed. That meant the people making the decisions had an opportunity to pause and seek clarification. Instead, the disputed arrangements continued. The room became quieter. William was no longer examining whether someone had made one poor judgment. He was examining whether a series of warnings had been ignored because the people involved believed the existing authority would protect them. That brought the confidential document back into the discussion. Its wording concerning future room use was read carefully. It did not declare ownership. It did not announce a transfer, but it described an arrangement that would give Camilla's side of the household greater control over specific areas. William asked why such an arrangement had been prepared at all. No immediate explanation resolved the issue. The document's date remained the hardest fact to overcome. It existed before the confrontation. That meant the argument itself could not have created the plan. It could only have exposed it. At that point, the internal review moved into its most serious stage. Officials compared the document against the occupancy conditions governing the residence. They examined whether the actions recorded in the review were consistent with those conditions. The conclusion was not based on one room or one piece of furniture. It rested on the accumulation of decisions. Access had been restricted, staff roles had changed, family belongings had been moved, household resources had been used for disputed alterations, warnings had reportedly been raised, and a future arrangement appeared to have been prepared before the dispute became public. Camilla still had an opportunity to explain why the evidence looked connected. Her response, according to the account, was that the changes had been misunderstood and that her authority had been interpreted too narrowly. But the review was no longer relying on interpretation alone. The officials returned to the written terms. The occupancy arrangement was conditional. It did not give unlimited control over the residence or automatically transform household use into permanent personal authority. The conditions surrounding the lodge required proper administration and respect for the arrangements governing family access and property. That finding changed the practical question. William no longer had to ask whether Camilla should reconsider the changes. He had to decide whether the conditions for her continued occupation had been breached. Catherine remained focused on the evidence. She did not turn the meeting into a personal confrontation. Her concern was whether the household could continue operating under competing instructions. The answer was becoming clear. It could not. William therefore requested the final internal assessment. Officials reviewed the disputed decisions against the residence conditions one more time. They checked whether the household had the authority to intervene if those conditions had been repeatedly breached. The answer came back in William's favor. The arrangement could be withdrawn. That was the moment the title of this story became more than a question about a residence. William and Catherine were no longer simply asking Camilla to reverse several decisions. They were preparing to end her occupation of Windsor Lodge. The decision was kept controlled. There would be no dramatic public statement before the process was complete. A formal notice was prepared. It required the disputed changes to stop, returned authority to household administration, and set a deadline for Camilla's departure. The notice also addressed staff access and personal belongings. The message was unmistakable. The residence would no longer operate under the structure that had been developing around Camilla. When the notice reached her, the response was immediate. Camilla did not accept the decision quietly. According to the account, she questioned the authority behind it and refused to treat the deadline as final. Her position remained that the matter could be resolved through further discussion and that the decision should not proceed while communication with Charles continued. But William had already moved beyond informal discussion. The review had produced a written record. The decision had been documented. The deadline had been set. And now the question was no longer whether Camilla would be asked to leave, it was whether she would actually leave when the time came. That distinction would soon become critical, because inside Windsor Lodge, staff were preparing for a handover while Camilla's side was still trying to stop the decision. The next stage would turn a private dispute into a direct test of authority. The preparations began before the deadline. Household administrators reviewed the inventory of the residence and separated items belonging to the lodge from belongings that could leave with Camilla. Security personnel were briefed on the new access arrangements. Staff were told that the handover would be conducted according to the written notice, not through private instructions delivered at the last moment. That precaution mattered because the review had exposed how easily verbal directions could create confusion. This time, every step would be recorded. Every room would be checked. Every key would be accounted for. Any disputed item would remain in place until its status could be established. Camilla's aides continued to argue that the decision could still be reversed. William did not change the deadline. Catherine did not withdraw the evidence, and the household administration did not reopen the question of whether the review had authority to act. For the first time, the residence was being prepared for a transfer of control, while the person losing that control was still inside it. The pressure was no longer hidden in documents. It was moving toward the front door. By the time the final preparations were complete, everyone involved understood what the next morning would bring. Officials would arrive. The rooms would be inspected. Staff would be reassigned. The keys would have to be returned. But one unresolved issue remained. What would happen if Camilla refused to surrender them? That question was about to receive an answer, and nobody knew whether the final confrontation would remain safely behind closed doors. If you believe powerful people should not be allowed to hide behind status when ordinary rules are being questioned, do not stay silent now. Subscribe, share this story, and stay with it, because the next part is where the order becomes real, the doors change hands, and the confrontation gets far more serious. The keys were on the table before anyone raised their voice. That was the moment the Windsor Lodge dispute stopped being a question of paperwork and became a question of whether Camilla would actually surrender the residence. The order had been issued. The deadline had arrived. Household officials were already inside, and every room now had to be checked against the inventory that William and Catherine had approved. The handover began quietly. There was no crowd outside and no public ceremony. Officials moved through the residence with lists in their hands. Personal belongings were identified separately from items regarded as part of the lodge. Boxes were checked, drawers were opened, keys were counted. The purpose was simple: restore control without creating another argument that could be dismissed as emotion. Camilla's aides challenged the process almost immediately. They questioned who had authorized the officials to enter and insisted that discussions with Charles were still continuing. The response was contained in the written notice. The deadline had passed. The authority governing the residence had changed. One disputed item was a set of framed pieces that had been placed among Camilla's belongings. Her staff reportedly considered them personal property. The inventory listed them differently. The officials asked for proof that they had been privately transferred. None was produced, so the items remained. The same process was applied to other objects. A writing desk was checked. 2 paintings were examined. A cabinet containing older correspondence was reviewed. Nothing left the residence simply because someone claimed it belonged to them. Each item had to be accounted for. That procedure mattered because the original dispute had grown out of uncertainty over who could decide what stayed, what moved, and who had access. Now there was no room for private interpretation. The inventory controlled the handover. Camilla eventually entered the main hall. Her response was reportedly controlled at first. She asked to see the senior official and challenged the timetable. She argued that the decision should wait until the matter had been discussed with Charles. But the official repeated the same point. Further conversations did not suspend the notice. The residence had to be surrendered. Camilla then accused William and Catherine of turning a household dispute into a personal attack. She rejected the idea that her actions had been designed to push Catherine aside. She also objected to the way the review had been conducted. William was not there to argue with her. His position had already been recorded in the review. The decision was based on the documents, the disputed instructions, the staffing evidence, the access changes, and the conditions governing the residence. Whether Camilla believed she had acted properly could not erase the record that had been assembled. Then a final point of resistance appeared. One private sitting room was still being treated as though it could remain under Camilla's control. An aide produced a key and argued that the room should remain sealed until Charles personally decided its status. The officials checked the occupancy schedule. There was no exception. The room was included in the handover. The key remained in the aide's possession for several tense moments. The senior official explained what would happen if it was not surrendered. The room would be opened under the authority already granted, its contents would be documented, and the refusal would become part of the handover record. Camilla finally gave the signal. The key was placed on the table. That small movement completed something far larger. A private assumption of authority had met a written limit, and the written limit had prevailed. By late afternoon, Camilla's personal staff were leaving in stages. Their vehicles were checked as packages were removed. Personal files were accounted for. Items belonging to the residents remained behind. The lodge became quieter. But the story did not end with the departure. William and Catherine now faced a second problem: restoring the residence without allowing the original dispute to disappear into another round of private explanations. The household administration began reviewing earlier room plans. Staff records were reopened. The belongings that had been moved were traced through storage lists. Items connected to William's late mother received particular attention because their removal had been one of the first discoveries that exposed the wider dispute. One sealed box remained especially important. Its label showed that the item inside had been scheduled for transfer. The box had not vanished, but its intended movement raised the same question that had driven the review from the beginning. Why had it been moved at all? The answer mattered because the object had not been removed after the confrontation. The instruction existed before the family fully understood what was happening. That timing returned the investigation to its most troubling discovery. The directive had been prepared weeks earlier. The date meant the confrontation did not create the plan. The confrontation exposed it. A senior aide reportedly confirmed that the earlier document had been discussed before Catherine challenged the changes. The aide could not establish every intention behind the document, but the timing was enough to change how the earlier events were viewed. If the arrangements had been planned in advance, then the restrictions, staff changes, room preparations, and movement of belongings could no longer be treated as a series of unrelated decisions without further explanation. That does not answer every question. It creates a larger one. Who expected the plan to continue without challenge? And who believed William and Catherine would never see the documents? Those questions remained after Camilla had left Windsor Lodge. The immediate dispute had been settled. The residents had returned to household administration. Staff knew that future changes would require clearer authorization. Personal belongings had been accounted for. The rooms could be restored. But trust was harder to restore. William had learned that verbal assurances could create confusion when written authority was absent. Catherine had learned that private restraint could be mistaken for permission. Staff had learned that silence could allow disputed instructions to travel much further than anyone expected. The story also left questions surrounding Charles. If Camilla had relied on his awareness or approval, what exactly had he known? Did he understand the extent of the room changes? Was he aware of the staffing decisions? Did he know that belongings connected to William's late mother had been moved? And if he had not approved those actions, why had his authority been invoked? No simple answer could resolve all of those questions. That uncertainty is what gives the Windsor Lodge dispute its lasting tension. The residence was no longer being treated as a space where authority could be assumed. The review had established a different expectation. Instructions affecting access, staff, spending, and family property needed a clear trail. For Catherine, the significance was personal as well as procedural. The belongings at the center of the dispute represented family memory. Their removal had shown how quickly an administrative decision could become something much more painful. For William, the issue had become a boundary. A royal title could command attention, but it could not automatically settle every question of authority. A private understanding could be claimed, but written conditions still mattered. And once records existed, they could be examined. That was the real consequence of the review. Camilla left Windsor Lodge, but the evidence remained. The most important document was not the final notice ordering her departure. It was the earlier directive that had existed before the confrontation. That document changed the meaning of everything that followed. It suggested that the dispute had not begun when Catherine discovered the missing belongings. It had begun earlier, quietly, through decisions that only became visible once someone started comparing dates. And that is why the question at the heart of this story remains so difficult. What was Camilla trying to establish inside Windsor Lodge before William and Catherine realized what was happening? The answer may never be fully known from the records described in this account, but the sequence is enough to explain why the situation became so serious. A restricted room led to questions. Missing belongings led to records. Records led to a wider review. The review uncovered a future plan. The future plan led back to an earlier date, and that earlier date changed everything. If you believe powerful people should answer for the decisions made behind closed doors, do not let this story end with silence. Subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications, and share this video so the next investigation reaches people who will not simply look away when authority is questioned. The next story coming here goes even deeper, and if this case has already made you uncomfortable, the one after it may be much harder to ignore.